welcome you to this forum, which we have Helen Ride here. She came from Provincetown to be with us and to share with us. And I'm just going to read her bio because it reads very well. Helen joined RMN in 2012 as regional organizer for the Northeast jurisdiction. She was born and brought up in the UK and moved to the US in 1998 to teach at a residential treatment center for children and adolescents with psychiatric and behavioral issues, which I'm sure will be a very tough job. In addition to her work as a regional organizer, Helen works part-time for a financial services company developing online learning courses. She graduated in postgraduate secondary education from Canterbury Christ Church University. She lives in Provincetown with her partner Kate and naughty but cute dog Bella. Helen has been a member of Provincetown UMC, a Reconciling congregation, since 2006. So we welcome her, and we would welcome any of you who would like to join our open and affirming committee. We have a terrific time, and we think we do some good work too. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I was really excited to get the invitation to come and chat with you guys. It's nice to get an invitation somewhere I can actually drive to in 2 hours because oftentimes invitations come and it's a little bit further afield and makes it a little tricky. So it's lovely to be local and to be in Massachusetts. So as my bio says, and you can tell, I'm originally not from around here. Southeast England is where I grew up. I've been here for about just over 16 years. And my position with RMN is a 20-hour-a-week position. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with the structure of how the Methodist Church is kind of set up, but and I didn't know that. I'm saying this because I had no clue until I had got my job. I didn't have that. I basically knew we were in a district, and the district was in a conference, and that was about the extent of my understanding. But the Methodist Church in the United States is divided into 5 jurisdictions, and RMN has a regional organizer for each jurisdiction. I have the Northeast jurisdiction, which is 10 annual conferences ranging from West Virginia, Peninsula, Delaware, Baltimore, Washington, or 3 conferences that are in Pennsylvania, sort of everything north and east of that, a large chunk of which obviously is New England, where you guys are. So that's kind of how I come to be here, I guess, right now. So I'm going to take, I think, about 20 minutes or so to just chat a little bit about these things. And then after that, we'll really be open for questions. And I hope maybe a little exploration around what it means to be, as a federated church, I have to say, this is my first time speaking in a federated church. So the whole dynamic of how that works together, UCC, UMC, this is a whole new territory for me. So it'll be interesting to explore, how federated church can engage in the work that some of the other Methodist churches are, and maybe then that fits in with how the UCC churches are working. I don't know how their open and affirming organisation works, but we can just have discussion around that. Does that sound good? If you've got questions at any point, there's no, feel free to interrupt or wave your arm around or whatever. Don't have to wait till the end for questions at all. So I've got 4 kind of main things that I wanted to chat about a little bit, and this was based on feedback from the committee. Seemed to be things that they thought people would be interested in hearing about. I'm going to talk a little bit about the United Methodist Church, what it means to be a United Methodist Church. I'm hesitant to even say that I'm going to try and talk to that because my knowledge of that is like seemingly limited. And so what I've learned I don't have a long history of, and I'm not born and brought up Methodist, so I've learned it as I've gone along. We're going to talk a little bit about that and social principles. We're going to talk a little bit about Reconciling Religious Network and how it relates to the UMC, a bit of history. We're going to talk about General Conference. This is looking ahead. The Methodist Church has a General Conference every 4 years where representatives, clergy and laity come together and discuss issues around the church and discuss making changes to things like the Book of Discipline and the social principles and things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit, not much about that, a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk more about acting locally. What does it mean to be a reconciling congregation here? This is technically new. Isn't Auburndale a town? I failed in my
It's a village.
Auburndale's a village inside of Newton.
There are 13, and you get points if you can name them all.
There are 13 villages inside Newton.
Right, and
Goodness
not
gracious.
else the capital.
Yeah. Is that an undisputed fact, or is that a maybe?
Lower Falls behind the back.
He almost got a dump slap.
That's too funny. So, does that sound good? Is everyone good with that? Sound like a plan? Okay, good. So, to start off, we're going to look a little bit at the Wesleyan heritage of the United Methodist Church. And there's no way in 5 minutes that we're going to even scratch the surface of this, by the way, so please understand.
Is this what you're working off of?
No. This is just, the people are free to say, I'll actually talk about that a little bit more from the IMNP. I didn't make copies, but what I did think was, if there's interest, I can PDF this and email it, and there are some links actually in it, so that I can email it and distribute it around. Okay. So the Wesleyan heritage, this is John Wesley. There are a few images of him on the internet. What did we do before the internet? I can't even imagine, but anyway. And one of the, do you know what? I want to thank you for inviting me to do this, because it really helped me dig a little bit deeper into what it means to have a Wesleyan heritage as a Methodist church. And I've not been a Methodist my whole life. I was brought up in the Church of England, High Church of England, which is kind of, smells and bells, we call it in England. So they ring around and they squish stuff on you. And then I went into, for a period of time before I moved over here, I was in a very non-denominational, evangelical charismatic churches. So we met in a church, we would meet in a school hall or a gymnasium. So we didn't have any trappings of sort of institutional church, if you like. And then since coming here, I didn't go for a while, and that's a long story we don't have time for right now. But I eventually landed at Provincetown United Methodist Church without any history of Methodism. It's just they were nice people. I thought I'll go there. So it's been a real blessing to me actually to do a little research on this, because it's actually made me feel like the Methodists have got such great, as much as we're hearing sort of awful things in the news right now, there's a great heritage in Methodism around social justice and working on behalf of the poor and those that aren't, that society would otherwise not pay attention to. One of the key things that Wesley emphasized was the idea of putting faith and love into action. It was never okay for Wesley that we sit in a room on our own and pray, and that was the extent of the expression of our faith. And the early Methodists and Wesleyans, of course, they came out of the Church of England. They were proponents of ending the slave trade. They were working to stop cruel treatment of prisoners. They were working for the poor, for working class labourers, for children. They were really committed to and investing in working, living out a life of faith that really had an impact in their community and on their world. And there are kind of three, and by the way, this information is all on umc.org, which is fantastic. There's actually a lot of information on there that I didn't realise. I was delving into it. It's some great stuff. So there are three kind of ideas around the Wesleyan heritage. And there's a whole piece on grace, but I kind of set that to one side. There's a whole section on Wesley's understanding of grace, but I really wanted to focus more in this forum around issues around social justice. So faith and good works. United Methodists insist that faith and good works belong together. What we believe must be confirmed by what we do. And that is very rooted in what John Wesley was about. And when they were gathering together in the first instances, that was very central to their work. Mission and service, that the love of God is always linked to love of neighbour and to a passionate commitment to seeking justice and renewal in the world. And when you read that, like, who doesn't want to be a Methodist? Doesn't that sound great? I mean, I don't know, but that's the kind of thing that really gets me excited about my faith, is reading that, like, yes, I want to have a commitment to seeking justice in the world. And then the nurture and mission of the church, which I'm a little bit like, I do this on my other job, like, and the fact that I obviously didn't format that box is bothering me. Just that really upsets me there, but I'll get over it. So again, for Wesley, there was no religion but social religion, no holiness but social holiness. In other words, faith always included a social dimension. It always was done in community with others for others. Okay? So you can see the common thread through there. And that, I think, is just... When I read that stuff, this is what happens in my head. I'm like, how can any Methodists not be in favour of standing up for LGBT community and seeking justice on their behalf? Because to me, it just totally speaks to that, right? It totally speaks to that desire to have an impact in the world and to stand up for those who are marginalised and discriminated against. Now, I was listening, I loved Sarah's sermon this morning, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. And as I listened, I was so excited because it totally seemed to, it was really aligning with what I've been learning about Wesleyanism and Methodism, right? So this is a quote from a book by a chap called Kenneth Carter, Who We Are, Doctrine, Ministry and Mission of the United Methodist Church. And I think this is fantastic. From Wesley's time to the present, Methodism has sought to be both a nurturing community and a servant community. Members of Methodist societies and class meetings, which is what Methodist churches were called before. I mean, there's a whole history, right, to the Methodists, and then we split. And it has ugly parts of the history too, right? Split, made bad decisions, came back together, said sorry, and on we move. So there's a whole history here, but here's the bit I love. Members of Methodist societies and class meetings met for personal nurture through giving to the poor, visiting the imprisoned, and working for justice and peace in the community. They sought not only to receive the fullness of God's grace for themselves, but they saw themselves as existing to reform the nation and spread scriptural holiness over the land. So that bit there that I highlighted in red, the way, and this is what I thought about. You know, we often think about we have a Bible study, we come together and we study the Bible together, and we're going to get fed by that, and we're going to get nurtured by that, and grow in our understanding. The way they met for personal nurture was by giving to the poor, visiting the imprisoned, working for justice and peace in the community. It was that which nurtured them. And if you could just read out that sentence that was in the end, Sarah, is that right?
As we explore how our power and privilege may lead to the deliverance of others, our own deliverance will be found.
When Sarah read that piece this morning, I was like, that's totally what this is about. As we seek the deliverance of others, as we seek to give to the poor, visit the imprisoned, work for justice and peace in the community, it's how our own deliverance is found. So we're not finding our faith or our spirituality necessarily in a vacuum, in a building with a door shut, but we're finding it in community and out in the community. And that is so much about what the Wesleyan movement and Methodism is about. So I hope that, I don't know, that just made me so excited. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm very excited about this. It's making me feel excited about being Methodist. And I'll be honest with you, I kind of felt like I was a Methodist by, like, oh, I just turned up at a Methodist church. But now I'm reading this stuff, I'm like, this totally resonates with me and how I feel about my faith. It's exciting. All right, so out of the, over time, and I don't know when the Book of Discipline was first written, but over time the Methodist Church developed this thing called the Book of Discipline, which kind of the rules and regulations. And if you've got more technical questions, Doug will be the person, or maybe even Sarah. There are others in the room who can speak more eloquently to this than I. But we have this thing called the Book of Discipline, and alongside the Book of Discipline we have something called the Social Principles. And again, the social principles, when you read the social principles, to me, this is again speaking personally, they get me excited about Methodism because they really speak to some fantastic and wonderful things. And there's a whole ton of stuff on the UMC website about this. But one of the things that the social principles say is that the United Methodist Church believes God's love for the world is an active and engaged love, a love seeking justice and liberty. Our church says that God's love is a love that seeks justice and liberty. That's what we believe, the Methodists. Not what you hear on the television necessarily, but that's what we believe. We cannot just be observers, so we care enough about people's lives to risk interpreting God's love, to take a stand, to call each of us into a response, no matter how controversial or complex. And the controversial and complex probably particularly comes into play right now. Right? But we're willing to take a stand no matter how controversial or complex. The church helps us think and act out of faith perspective, not just responding to all the other mind makers up I don't think I could have ever made that up, mind makers up, whatever that means, that exists in our society. And the social principles go on obviously much more than that, but what we've ended up with in the Methodist Church is, as my boss Rachel likes to say, we're in a big hot mess. Because we have this heritage, this amazing Wesleyan heritage, right, of a passionate belief in social justice and liberty and so on. But what we've ended up with our book of discipline and with the social principles, is a mess. I don't know if that's probably, I don't know if you, would you agree though? It's fair enough. So in one breath, and I contemplated quoting chapter and verse on what the particular book of discipline says and what the social principles say, but I figured we'd just pare it down to kind of four main things. One is, which stand in opposition to each other. So at one point in our text we talk about that all people are of sacred worth. We don't have any differentiation. All people are sacred worth. But at the same time, we say that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching.
You mentioned a couple, or had some information from the UMC website.
Yes.
I haven't actually been in there recently.
I just redid it.
After I've never been in there.
Yeah.
Does it talk about that at all on the website, in any sense, do you know?
So there's a page, and I just got to cover this yesterday as I was doing my research. There's a page about what the Methodists believe about homosexuality. And this is kind of a summary of that page in a way.
Okay.
So there's more, and I can make sure there's a link to that in what I send out. And it does address it, but the things that it emphasizes, to be honest with you, are much more the incompatible with Christian teaching. So you'll hear repeated that one of the things that RMN is fighting against is this language in the Book of Discipline that's so harmful. It says that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Well, how does that feel as a gay person? Doesn't feel too good, okay? That we don't allow self-avowed practicing homosexuals to be clergy. So they're not allowed to be ordained. And if they are ordained, they have to basically go into the closet. And that's what's happened for years and years and years. And yet at the same time, the vows which ordained clergy take, and which we believe as an institution, is that we should be in ministry for and with all people. So can you see how these two things are just constantly colliding, right? And I would say that the language on the website is erring much more on those things that we believe that are against the LGBT community. So it does mention the sacred worth piece. It does say that we consider everyone has sacred worth. There's also language around that we should, that the LGBT community should not be oppressed, that they should have equal rights. That's in there. And yet at the same time, right within our own documents, there we are discriminating. So it's a mess. The bottom line is it's a mess. And when I send the link, I'll send the link to that page because the page actually quotes the sections from the different book of discipline, social principles, and there's a lot of information about that. So, a couple of things to mention. I'm going to start with talking about RMN in a minute. How am I doing for time?
You're fine.
I'm all right so far? Okay. The discriminatory language that is in the Book of Discipline wasn't always there. It was put in there in the 1970s. And it was put in there as a response to things like the Stonewall riots and gay rights becoming more prevalent, is that the church was like, well, we can't have them coming here with their gay rights, let's put in some stuff that says what we believe. So the language was put in the 70s, so it's not always been there. And over time, there's been efforts to change the language and remove language, and sometimes they put in better language, so at some points the fact, for example, that everyone should be treated, I can't remember the exact language, but that there shouldn't be, people should have equal rights, they should, we implore you not to, I can't remember the exact language, we implore you not to basically, don't be mean to the gay people, it's essentially what it's saying, right? But at the same time, they also they continued to add harmful language. At the last General Conference, there was a motion to remove some of the language, and in the end they couldn't even agree to disagree. That was the big thing at the last conference was, can we at least say out loud that we don't all agree on these issues? Apparently we can't. So since the 70s, there have been groups that have started within the Methodist Church to be a voice of the LGBT community. It started in 1975 with the United Methodist Gay Caucus. They then became Gay United Methodists and had a strong presence at General Conference in 1976. Now, I will also send a link, there's a page on the RMN website which takes you through much more detail around the history of the work, but this is just a very high-level view of how things have progressed. In 1997, Gay United Methodists changed their name to become Affirmation, and the group Affirmation still exists. It's still an LGBT organisation. None of these organisations are inside the institution of the Methodist Church, because one of the pieces that we have in the laws is that we can't spend money on or support a gay caucus. That language is in there. So these are all organisations that work solely in the Methodist Church but are not inside the institution of the Methodist Church. That makes sense? I think they're called unofficial caucuses. It's kind of the term that's used.
So what you're saying is that the United Methodist Church in no way supports today the Reconciling Ministries?
Not at all, no. And in some conferences that extends to, in most conferences I would say, it means we can't advertise our events on, so like the district supervisor sends out an email, and oftentimes churches say, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing the other, or other organisations will say this. They will refuse to put in anything that's LGBT related. Not all. There are some conferences that will allow it, but a lot of times they won't. And again, it depends on the part of the country you're in, right?
You may be getting to this later on,
Yeah.
but it's not in the UMC, but can you talk about the interaction between some of these, maybe you're going to get to that, between the actual church, UMC, and these different groups or offices? So they interact or don't interact? Or?
Yes, so in a way I would see a reconciling. Let me just get to the end of this slide and I'll speak to that. Is that okay?
Yep.
So Affirmation in 1982, and obviously tons of stuff happening in between here, but this is just high level. In 1982/1984, the Affirmation group decided to form the Reconciling Congregation Program, and the focus on that was to really work on individual congregations and get congregations to say we're a reconciling congregation. We don't agree with this language in the Book of Discipline. We don't agree that people should be included and welcomed and celebrated. And they started what was called at the time the Reconciling Congregation Program, which was sort of a subset of the Affirmation group when it started. And then in 1989 it was decided that the Reconciling Congregation Program should become independent of Affirmation. So again, Affirmation still exists. The Reconciling Congregation Program became independent, and then in 2000 it was renamed Reconciling Ministries Network, which is what we have today. So that's very high level. And so the work that RMN does, I can't remember if I have a slide on this, so I don't want to start talking about it. I've got a slide. One moment, please. We seek to influence and work within the structure of the United Methodist Church, but we're not a part of it. So we would have, we've built, there's now a network of over 500 reconciling congregations across the country, which sounds like a large number until you hear how many Methodist churches there are, and then it's a pretty small number. But it's growing, and actually I will tell you that since all the stuff that's happened in recent, like in last year, the DOMA thing, the Frank Schaeffer trial and other things, the interest has really ratcheted up. I mean, it's not at all uncommon for us to get an email from a church that we had no previous contact with, had no idea that they might be having this discussion, and suddenly this discussion is happening because it's hitting the news so much. So we have local groups that work with the bishops, with the district superintendents. We have bishops, we have retired bishops on our board that work with the bishops. So there's all kinds of ways. I guess it's kind of like a lobbying group in that sense, right? So we're working within the institutional structure, but are not part of it.
Can I say one quick thing?
Yeah, sure, please.
There are two other social justice organizations that
Yes.
are
Yeah.
accepted by the denomination. One is
Yeah.
Church and Society, the Board of Church and Society, and also Methodist for Social Action.
Mhm.
Both of those groups do have access to
Mhm.
boards of, where decisions are made, and
Yeah.
RMN is a part of Church and Society's program and Charter MFSA. So
Yeah.
they're well represented inside of Church and Society. So often you'll see legislation that comes through as Church and Society legislation, and it actually has a reconciling heart.
Yeah.
So that's why there's a close tie to United Methodist Church through those two boards.
Yes.
Are you saying that the Church and Society group is recognized financially by the UMC?
Practically, no. Well, yes. I mean, Church and Society is funded by the United Methodist Church,
Okay.
and it's resourced by RMN. So
Okay, right.
you can kind of put that
So we
together.
feed information, you know, the
Right.
relationships that we have. Yeah. So officially, we're not in it, but we have ways into it, I guess is right. Yes.
Follow what Lucia asked, when you say, what do you mean when you say accepted that? I mean, I sort of can generally understand that, but how do you
So,
describe
as I
that?
understand it, right about when it was Reconciling Congregation Program, that's about when this prohibition came about in the denomination
Right.
against funding gay caucuses, because they could see this movement growing. So, it was a reactive kind of prohibition, and other groups like MFSA, there hasn't been the same kind of reaction against them. So when I say that they're accepted, they're not challenged. I mean,
Right.
but Reconciling doesn't submit legislation for the conference. I've never seen reconciling legislation. So they've just learned that the way to work into legislation is by folding it under Church and Society. Right.
So in some
Then it's not rejected out of hand.
Yeah. In some conferences, a local reconciling, so we have, at RMN, we have what, it works differently in different conferences, but we have what we call an annual conference team, which would be a team of reconcilers within that conference that seek to, organise activities, reconciling related activities within the conference. And in some conferences, they do submit legislation themselves, but oftentimes it'll be a church will submit it on behalf, a reconciling church will submit it under their name.
Or just an individual.
Or an individual can, exactly. So it works in ways. I know that in New England, MFSA does a lot of the Northern side does a lot of stuff. So just a quick word about some of the ministries within Reconciling Ministries Network. We have what we call extension ministries. Reconciling Ministries Clergy is a group. We have the Parents Reconciling Network, which is a really strong group, parents of LGBT folk. Mosaic is the seminarians and young adults group. We have United Methodists of Colour for an Inclusive Church and Transgender Extension Ministries. I don't know why they haven't got a nice sign. I'm going to have to get on that. They don't have a nice symbol yet. So we have groups. So within our organisation, we have groups that focus on particular areas of ministry, particular groups, which you can also individually be a part of. So if you are a parent of an LGBT child, you can be affiliated with the Parents Reconciling Network, for example. Okay. I have got down here some leaflets about reconciling ministries, which you're free to take, and a few stickers. I'll hold up on a few stickers if you want to stick on your car. If you're a sticker on your car kind of person. So far I'm not, but it's a new car. You know how it is? So a new car, you're like, oh, stick in there. All right, so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about General Conference. And one of the questions that had come up when I was talking with the committee was, what's RMN doing about what's going on in the Methodist Church? Like, what is our strategy? RMN has a board of directors. They just met in Nashville in February, and they are formulating, and typically how a strategy, because the Methodist Church works on this 4-year kind of cycle, typically our strategies kind of are aligned to work on a similar kind of cycle. So for the first couple of years following General Conference, which was really devastating actually, to be honest, as far as LGBT stuff is concerned, and there were many harmful things that happened. So our focus for the last couple of years has really been on just beefing up the grassroots nature of our movement. So that's why the regional organisers were appointed, to really kind of connect more with local churches, get more churches to become reconciling, encourage folks in local conferences to get more active in terms of putting on events and reaching out. And we've been doing that, and it's been really successful. And now we're coming up to 2 years away from the next General Conference, and this focus shifts a bit. But one of the things that came out of the last General Conference, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at, I think there's a video snippet on the RMN site, was Bishop Tolbert's call to biblical obedience. And that really is kind of our frame and our focus as we move towards, has been for the last 2 years and continues to be. And the whole idea around biblical obedience is those that are on the conservative end of our denomination like to claim the high ground by saying we follow the Bible, we're biblically grounded, and you guys are not biblically grounded, you're doing what you want to do, riding roughshod with the Bible and so on. And one of the things that Bishop Tolbert encouraged us to do is to really claim that back and say, this is not the truth. The truth is we are totally biblically grounded in what we do. And we are going to seek to be, we're so biblically grounded that we're going to seek to be more obedient to what the Bible tells us to do than what our book of discipline tells us to do. The book of discipline is a book of man, right? It's constructed for the institution. And what we've been called to do is to be biblically obedient. And that's why we've been seeing more clergy willing to be open about performing same-sex weddings, even though it's prohibited. It's why we've seen more and more churches signing up to become reconciling, and we've seen more work around the reasoning behind it to say, we believe that Jesus called us to love our neighbour as ourselves, and we don't believe that the book of discipline allows us to do that. So as far as the book of discipline actually prevents us from living out a biblical witness, the gospel life, we're going to follow the Bible, not the book of discipline. And biblical obedience is really the frame for what's going to be happening going forward to General Conference. We are going to continue to work with our coalition partners on legislative goals, which will include the removal of discriminatory language and making sure that no additional harmful language is added. And what we're really going to be focusing on is encouraging our churches and our members to really have a witness around biblical obedience, living out the gospel in a real and authentic way, which is kind of where we come back to where we are here today. Because everything is grounded in where are we for such a time as this, right? The story of Esther. God has put us here you are in the village of Auburndale, in the town of Newton, or is it a city? Town.
City.
Oh, it's a city? I'm from England, I don't understand all these things. What does this mean? What does biblical obedience mean? How does it get worked out in reality here in Auburndale? So, that's my question.
So the slide that was just there, when you say the General Conference for 2016, that's what the RMN is focusing on? Or is that the theme of the General Conference?
General Conference happens on its own, like it's its own thing. RMN's focus for General Conference, and by the way, this is still formulating, so they haven't been... We don't have scripted talking points yet, if that makes sense, in the sense that it's still coming together.
Okay.
But the two big pieces that we know are going to be a focus are, one is that we're going to work with our coalition partners. So last 4 years ago, there was a Love Your Neighbour coalition which brought together a number of groups within the Methodist Church to work on legislative issues, and that's going to happen again. And we will work with that coalition group on that. And at the same time, we're really going to be focusing on this idea of biblical obedience and what does that mean locally? How do we work that out and live that out? And really stand up against what the media is saying about the Methodist Church, because all that's hitting the news, right, is not good stuff. So what does biblical obedience look like? It should say in Auburndale under leather. He got cut off. Do you recognise that? All right, I'm going to step around the other side of it a little bit. So one of the things that we've been doing is doing these trainings around to train folks up to help congregations that are not yet reconciling to think about going through the reconciling process. Now, we are in Massachusetts, are we not? And we would think that there are a lot of reconciling churches in Massachusetts, but they are by far not the majority. Even within the Methodist Church, right? They are by far not the majority. So here we have Auburndale, and you are a reconciling congregation. And the other little orange thing over there is Sudbury. And actually, I'm going there next week, because they're celebrating their 10 years of being reconciling next week. So one of the things I want you to consider as you think about how can we live into our privilege and how can we use it, right? How can we use the fact that we've figured this out? What can we do good with that, right? is to think about these other Methodist churches. And I'm talking about Methodists here, right, because this was the whole point, right, was to get the Methodist perspective on things. And I haven't mapped UCC because it's not in my database. So these are Methodist churches within a relatively short distance of where you guys are, and none of them are reconciling.
Have any of them contacted you?
Nope.
Belmont and Watertown or not?
So here's the thing, there may be, I am absolutely certain there are individual Reconciling United Methodists in maybe all of these churches. Maybe not all, but in a number of them.
I'm pretty sure Carter Memorial.
But they have not gone through an official kind of discernment process around whether they want to be reconciling. Maybe they don't think it's important. Do you think you could make an argument to them why it might be important?
Yeah.
Totally, right? Because even here in Massachusetts, we can get like a little bit blasé about the gay thing, like, gay marriage, we did that, right? Yeah, we're all over it. But the fact of the matter is twofold. One is, oftentimes it still doesn't get talked about in our churches. So if you're a gay person in those churches, even though what you're hearing on the news about Methodist Church is not great, we want people to be able to go to all these churches and know for a fact, like there's a rainbow flying outside your church. I know I can walk in the door and I'm going to be fine as a gay person. That's an amazing thing. I don't know, if you're not gay, I don't know if you realize how incredible that is, actually. It's huge. Because I've been in churches that look pretty innocuous and look like there'd be nice people inside. I was going to one for a while, actually, when I was living in Central Mass, and I've been there a few times, and everything was moving on quite nicely. And then one Sunday morning, goodness gracious, did I overhear about how bad I was as a gay person. Nice little white church, nice people. So the fact that you have that out there is awesome. It's absolutely brilliant. So my thought to you is, what role can Auburndale play, your UMC piece, can play in potentially reaching out to some of these places and having conversations and seeing whether they might be interested in having a conversation? Because it's not, my feeling is it's not just about in Massachusetts. If I was to swing back from this map, which I didn't do, and look at the whole of the United States, the picture is bleak. It's bleak. You only have to read the news to see how bleak it is. One of the main focuses, apart from the general conferencing that RMN is going to be focusing on, is a Southern initiative. Because there's a lot of talk in the Methodist Church around schism and do we need to split? Is there nothing that can hold this together? But here's what happens if it splits. What happens to the LGBT folks in Louisiana and Mississippi? We're kind of like cutting a rope and saying, sorry. That's pretty devastating if you're down there and you're trying to be a witness and you're trying to speak up for inclusion. It's devastating. So my feeling is there are potentially people and individuals who could be passionate about this work, and what influence might they be able to have? And maybe they're sitting in a pew here, and they just need a little bit of encouragement to say, oh, I could do that, I could help with that.
About 8 years ago at the General Conference, there was a discussion of having, I know that the African Church has a slightly different discipline. So there was a discussion of making different disciplines, because there are some areas of the world where it's much more conservative. And so I'm wondering if that's still alive or that's died a death.
So there's a few things going on. There are conversations happening. So the Northeast jurisdiction has a jurisdictional team that's working on, and they're not the only ones, there are other groups working at a conference level and jurisdictional levels to discuss what might the options be for a structural change that wouldn't require a split, but would allow the American church to be culturally sensitive and make adjustments. So that's definitely in discussion. None of these things are worked out, but it's certainly part of discussion. And one of the things, do any of you get an email from me once a month? Do you know what that means? It means you're not a Reconciling United Methodist. And shall I tell you something else? You don't have to be a Methodist to be a Reconciling United Methodist. I actually looked it it up. On our database, there's one Reconciling United Methodist. But here's why. It's just a way of getting information, right, about what's happening in the wider movement across the country, which I think is really important. One of the things I didn't speak to about Methodism is the connectional nature of Methodism. It's a very connected church, and that's why this whole thing is such a big deal, because we're not independent. We don't just sit in our Methodist church sort of independently doing what we want to do. It is connected, and that's why this becomes so important. One of the things I'm going to be sending out in my email next week is a link to a proposal that the Northeast Jurisdiction team has put together, and they're trying to get feedback around, and they're putting together some ideas around what might be ways in which we could approach this that doesn't require a split, and what might some options be. So if you're on the list, then you get that email. It's a little plug. And if you'd like to be on that list, there is a donation alert, so you can feel free to donate, but you don't either have to. You can just sign up some information here and either leave it with me today or send it in to the address here, and then you'll just get set up with emails and get regular emails around what's happening with Reconciling Ministries Network in the Northeast and Weatherfield. Yes,
A number of us are on Sarah's list.
you have a list?
Do what?
You have an email list?
Oh yeah, she sends us stuff.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you just want me to send the emails?
Well, I think it's better for people individually, because then they can choose, and that way they can subscribe or unsubscribe, you know, you've got that choice. So, but we're pretty moderate around, we don't like slam your email or inbox, we're very considered around how many emails we send out. So that's a way to stay in touch. One of the things that we're doing, and I'm going to stop and ask you questions in just about 3 seconds. One of the things we're doing coming up on May 9th and 10th is a training in Springfield, Mass, which I Googled it, and it's only an hour and 20 minutes from the Pike, which is like, you could practically jump on, I think, from here, more or less. Down the Pike, very, very close. And we're going to do a process church training, and that's to train folks up to help congregations become reconciling. So what we do is we have, if we have a team within a church, the group of people who want to talk about become reconciling, we can partner them up with somebody else who's been trained and just helps them, encourages them along. And half the time, it's all about pick up the phone and say, hey, did you guys have a meeting yet? Good, when's the next meeting? You know, it's just a little encouragement to see, make sure that they're moving the process through. So again, information about that will come out in the email. I'll do a special Auburndale email separate from the other thing I was talking about. Okay. So that might be one way. And that map thing, that's just one way or suggestion or thought about how you guys might be able to potentially influence and live into, you know, expanding your influence around here, around LGBT stuff. But there are many others. That's supposed to say end time for questions. You know what it is? I used a font that you don't have. It's a funky font. That's why.
Don't blame me. That's
I'm not blaming you. So, what are some other ways that Auburndale might be able to live into this, and ways you can use your knowledge and your privilege and your understanding in this area or beyond?
Well, just on a historic note, the village church of Wellesley had a display which was both photography and a whole show that was put together, teenage, LGBT people. And it was out of that a team came to this parish and talked to the parish council and encouraged us. And that's kind of how the ball started.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you for that story. That's awesome.
Do you remember that?
No.
UCC church. Yeah, on the list.
Yeah, right.
It's the same principles. Yeah.
I was moderator, so I remember.
The other thing I was going to mention is that the UCC and the UMC around the LGBT issue there's two ways that institutions can change, from the top down and the bottom up. And with the UCC, they made the changes institutionally, and then gradually it's kind of filtered down through the system. But I'm pretty sure there are churches, UCC churches, that are not living into the open and affirming agreements that were made up here. The Methodist Church is a mess up here, but we've got a fabulous grassroots movement that's really building and growing. So the change is moving from the bottom up in the Methodist Church. You see what I mean? So the change has to happen. So even if, by some miracle, and it would take a miracle, frankly, there was a significant change in 2016 that really shifted things, the work is still to be done, right? The people sitting in the pews, oftentimes, maybe even just down the road, don't fully understand what this is about. Never mind in Mississippi or Louisiana, or places like in the South where, you know, it's just tough, it's so hard. So the work's there, regardless of what the institution, where the institution's at, is still work needs to be done, so, yeah.
So I'm UCC, so I'm not quite sure I'm ready to cross over.
No, please. No, I'm not in
You made it sound good.
No, but I do know I want to be your friend. I think you're awesome, and thank you so much for that, because what you've done is to reframe this, that it's time to stop being angry and put all of our knowledge and energy into getting refocused and back to what we started out doing a long time ago. And I really appreciate your humor and making this clear. So, and I'm part of the Open and Affirming Committee, so I don't have any excuses really, but I really appreciate.
And being so positive.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, you know, it's a tough time for the Methodists right now. I mean, just this week, and I know some folks were talking about it. You know, the Ogletree case that happened in New York to come to just resolution was huge. It was. I mean, that's a big shift, and I think that holds out hope. But the aftermath conversation was that this was, you know, this was a just resolution in that case. Our hope is that it sets precedent for how others might be able to be handled, and I think it's a huge thing. But there's a ton of work to be done. There's so much work to be done. But I feel like our history and our roots speak to the fact that we're on the right track, right? We're heading in the right direction. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say that, just to sort of respond to you, Mary Lou, is that the joining as a Reconciling United Methodist is just an email.
Yes.
First of all, it doesn't have to be money.
No,
It can be. It doesn't have to be money. And it doesn't mean you're not UCC.
No.
Oh, no,
So in our database, you get to, you know, we have people who are UCC, but they're reconciling anti Methodists in the sense that they're on board with what we're trying to do, right? So, yeah. Yes, sorry.
I think you spoke to it in bits and pieces, but what would you say to someone who says that these differences are irreconcilable, there needs to be a schism? Like how would you just address
So I think
those people who are so committed they just say, be done?
Yeah, I don't, you know, my feeling is that in the Methodist, so speaking to the Methodist thing, is that Wesley was clear that people did not have to agree on everything to be, even it was the quote, can we not love alike, even if we can't think alike, can we not love alike? Something like that. But essentially it was, we may differ and interpret things differently, but if our underlying thing, which is frankly the underlying thing in the Christian faith period, right, is loving each other and our neighbours, if that becomes the central thing. But I have to say that it's hard because, I mean, just the cultural, as a Brit coming into the United States, the cultural setup in this country is built on I'm here and you're here, the whole thing. And the whole concept of people coming together and agreeing to disagree, which they failed to do at General Conference, it just seems to be very, very hard. And I don't know that I haven't asked that. My hope would be, because I believe that schism would be, this is not an RMN stance, this is Helen speaking, right? My feeling is that, and I don't even know what RMN thinks about it, but I think our commitment is to the Methodist Church, and the Methodist Church should be able to live together